When Emily Bronte published her Gothic masterpiece Wuthering Heights in 1847, she wrote under the male pen name Ellis Bell in order to preserve her anonymity and defend her work from unfounded criticism. And there was criticism. This is a story that's long, multifaceted, and full of characters who can be unpleasant and sometimes just straight up evil. One initial reviewer in 1847 noted that the characters were realistic, but didn't mean this as a compliment. He writes, "In spite of its truth to life in the remote nooks and corners of England, Wuthering Heights is a disagreeable story. The authors do not turn away from developing upon those physical acts of cruelty which we know have their warrant in the real annals of crime and suffering. The brutal master of the lonely house on Wuthering Heights, a prison which might be pictured from life, has doubtless had his prototype in those ungenial and remote districts where human beings, like the trees, grow gnarled and dwarfed and distorted." Another reviewer in the same year wrote that the only consolation we have on Wuthering Heights is that it will never be widely read. He was very wrong. The same intensity of emotion and unflinching portrayal of ugliness that made it so unappetizing to contemporary readers have made the book age better than some of its contemporaries, which can sometimes be accused of being a little too stuffy or moralistic. Not by me, but by others. Whether its particular flavor of melodrama agrees with you or not, Wuthering Heights isn't a narrative that's shy about particularly anything. But there isn't a definitive adaptation of Wuthering Heights the way there is for, say, Pride and Prejudice or Emma or The Wizard of Oz or countless other classics. For that reason, Wuthering Heights has never entered the mainstream, non-literary pop culture consciousness as prominently as some other classics have. There's many reasons this could be. The nature of the frame stories with nested narratives can be pretty hard to adapt. The novel takes place over a period of about 40 years, and films are only about 2 hours long. There is a broad cast of characters that all merit focus, and honestly, Hollywood isn't always comfortable portraying complexity, moral complexity. But despite all these logistical difficulties, has anyone made it? In the 100 something years that we've had cinema, has there been a Wuthering Heights adaptation that is actually any good? My hypothesis is that no, there hasn't been, because I don't think most filmmakers fully understand the story that they're adapting. When you take a story about creating and breaking out of cycles of violence and abuse and you turn it into a romance novel, there's some things that are going to be lost in translation. Thankfully, I understand the story they are adapting because I have all the correct opinions, and I will use this correct interpretation to evaluate all attempts. I even read the book for the uptime time to add data points to my confirmation bias. I'm sure, given the timing of this, that everyone is thinking of the 2026 Emerald Fennel adaptation, and I'm not going to talk about that. A lot of people have already talked about it. I don't think it'll be any good, and I don't want to waste any more time thinking about it than I already have. From this point on, there will be liberal spoilers for both the novel and the 9 or so adaptations that I'll be discussing. But first, for the uninitiated. Wuthering Heights is a Gothic novel that takes place in Yorkshire in England and begins the winter of 1801. It's told using a frame story. A visiting tenant who would dearly like to figure out what is wrong with his weird landlord Heathcliff and why the moors appear to be haunted is hearing the story from an eyewitness, his housekeeper Nellie Dean. Nellie Dean, who's worked for these families her whole life, remembers Heathcliff as a young foundling child, a child of indeterminate but definitely not white ethnicity who was plucked off the streets of Liverpool by a wealthy Mr. Earnshaw and brought home to his children. Dubbed Heathcliff no last name, he immediately becomes close friends with the younger daughter, Catherine, and is hated by the elder son, Hindley, who's jealous that his father is paying attention to a poor beggar boy and not him. When old Mr. Earnshaw dies, Hindley becomes master of the house. Hindley reduces the young Heathcliff to the state of a servant, mistreating him, denying him schooling and a place in the family, and forcing him into manual labor. Heathcliff and Catherine continue to be close companions, despite discouragement from the older Hindley. They have very similar temperaments and like to be wild and roam the moors doing mischief together. The wildness and freedom symbolized by the moors is constantly present in the book. As Heathcliff and Catherine enter adulthood, Catherine is courted by their wealthy neighbor, Edgar Linton. Catherine confesses that she's planning to accept a marriage proposal from Edgar Linton, because obviously she could never marry Heathcliff, even though she likes him better and he's the only one who understands her in the whole world, and they're practically the same person, and she wouldn't feel at home in the world without him, and whatever souls are made of hers and his are the same. Heathcliff, unfortunately, was only listening to the first part of this, and dipped immediately after "it would disgrace me to marry Heathcliff." Heathcliff. He runs off into the night and is not seen or heard from in 3 long years. Catherine, left behind, marries rich neighbor Edgar Linton because the girl's got to provide for herself. 3 years later, Heathcliff returns, but he has mysteriously made a significant fortune and carries himself like a gentleman. No one knows how he made the fortune. Best guess is deal with the devil, but it's enough to take him from Heathcliff no last name to Mr. No first name Heathcliff. Heathcliff does a lot with his newfound position in life. He wins all of Hindley's riches and land off of him in a card game, and he spends a lot of time with Cathy in a way that makes her husband uncomfortable. Cathy herself is unbothered. She's not with Edgar Linton because she actually likes him, so she sees no problem making adulterous eye contact with her beloved childhood friend right in front of Linton's salad. Edgar Linton bears with the adulterous eye contact as long as he can, but he puts his foot down when Heathcliff elopes with his younger sister Isabella so that he can steal her fortune. He bans Heathcliff from his house, and Cathy, in a fit of defiance and rage, has an absolute fit and protest, which develops into a fever. At the climax of this fit, she gives birth to a baby girl and dies. The baby girl is named Catherine after her, which is not confusing at all. Cathy's older brother, Hindley Earnshaw, who again has lost all of his fortune to gambling debts, dies shortly after her. Heathcliff is now left with Hindley's house, Hindley's wealth, and Hindley's young son Hareton, who he puts to work as a servant, much like he once was. It's not enough to marry and abuse the sister of one childhood bully. You have to recreate your childhood torment in your childhood bully's son. So that the bully is karmically tormented beyond the grave, even if he's too dead for you to fully enjoy it. Runaway sister Isabella Linton also bears Heathcliff a son, who she names Linton, after her own maiden name and/or her brother. Linton Heathcliff grows up whiny and sickly and kind of annoying, but he is his father's heir. But Heathcliff isn't done. When his son Linton and Catherine II are mostly grown, he first puppets and then forces Catherine to marry Linton. And then he bullies Linton into leaving everything in the will to him, his father. Catherine's now sickly father dies shortly after, and then the young Linton dies as well, leaving Heathcliff as the sole inheritor to both family fortunes and the last laugh against anyone who has ever mistreated him. But now that he's won, the fun's kind of gone out of it. When Catherine II and Hareton Earnshaw begin to slowly, quietly fall in love, he doesn't want to break it apart and make them both miserable like he once would have. Mostly, he just misses his own Cathy. Heathcliff gets into a strange mood, walking the moors at all hours of the day, talking to Cathy, refusing to eat, and after so many days of that, he succumbs to his hunger and dies. Cathy II and Hareton are left to reclaim the family fortunes and ancestral home. They get married, which Catherine I and Heathcliff never would have been able or allowed to do, and thus right the wrongs of their parents. I read this as a story about cycles of violence and abuse and about the social factors that create these cycles. After 300 pages of compounding darkness and misery and people being terrible to one another, the ending we arrive at is a surprisingly gentle one. Hareton and Catherine II coming into their own and finally manage to achieve joy is such a triumph. Their love is a much simpler, softer one. She teaches him to read, he plants her some flowers. They don't need anguished declarations of love. In a way, Hareton and Cathy's relationship, the wealthy but socially caged heiress and the mistreated servant boy, is a redemption of Catherine and Heathcliff's. But at the same time, it's a slap in the face to Catherine and Heathcliff's. Their marriage is treated as the return of the rightful heir. Heathcliff never would have been celebrated like that or celebrated at all. He's the wrong kind of person. He's not white, he's poor, he's continuously treated as if he's done something wrong until he snaps and does do something wrong. So even as we let out a sigh of unease at it finally being over, there's a sense of unease because the social factors that created all the chaos are still there. So it could still happen again. Anyone who reads this book and concludes, wow, he loved her so much, instead of, wow, that was kind of messed up, isn't wrong per se, but they're missing out on a lot. Most adaptations of the book only adapt the first half. They end immediately after Catherine's death. So, here. There's still this much book left. These adaptations don't include the second generation, Heathcliff's elaborate revenge plans, the happy ending at the end, Heathcliff's death. I understand why they do this. Most of the action and drama is in the first half. Adapting the full novel sees you having to add a second set of characters to the cast halfway through and aging up the principal cast, which is difficult to do at all, never mind in the length of time you have available in a feature film. But if you're cutting it in half, you can tell some of the same story, but you can't say the same things with it. We don't get to see generational cycles be repeated or resolved if there aren't any generations, so thematically, you do need all of it. Wuthering Heights is not a romance in the traditional modern sense, but it does contain a very prominent love story, and that love story exists within the context of the world that created it. Social pressures, family dysfunction, uneasy class conflict. The love between Catherine and Heathcliff is often treated as some unearthly, mysterious, destructive thing, but really it's kind of simple. They're childhood friends. They can be themselves with each other and not with anyone else. Heathcliff was the only one to care for Cathy when she was a wild little girl running barefoot through the moors. Cathy was the only one to care for Heathcliff when he was a downtrodden servant boy. They represent to one another not so much childhood innocence, but the brief period of childhood in which they had each other and were able to find happiness in that. They're obsessed enough with each other to kick off the whole chain events of the plot, and their relationship is never even consummated. Some adaptations frame their relationship as a kind of good girl, bad boy, with Heathcliff corrupting or frightening Cathy, but especially if we take Cathy's word for it about their souls being the same, they have the same capacity for cruelty. Catherine just never has to use it. The expectations that are put on a servant boy and a wealthy woman are very different. Her marriage with Edgar is described as being happy because everyone stays out of her way and makes sure she doesn't make a fuss. Heathcliff, too, is incredibly ruthless, but not recklessly so. He isn't cruel for the sake of being cruel. His cruelty is incredibly focused and goal-oriented. Once he comes back as Mr. Heathcliff, he specifically wants to get back at everyone who ever hurt him and accumulate as much of their money and land as possible in doing so. At the end, when these goals are fulfilled, he loses a sense of purpose and becomes hopeless and despondent in response. Without these factors, Cathy is being trapped in her own femaleness and identifying with Heathcliff, Heathcliff's rage at being mistreated and desire to get back at society, their mutual childhood which bonded them together. Without these factors, they aren't the same characters anymore and have little reason to care about each other in the way they do in the text. Reducing them to jealous lovers is very boring and ignores all the complexities. Arguably, the biggest factor that affects Heathcliff is his race. Heathcliff is a foundling whose origins are unknown. He is described as having dark hair and dark skin, and is referred to by many other characters using a term now considered offensive, which refers to the Romani people. The Roma are a nomadic group that migrated up from northern India into Europe sometime in the Middle Ages, and I cannot express enough how strong discrimination is against the Roma to this very day. In Eastern Europe, where I grew up, there's whole generations of families that live on the streets because the stigma against them is so strong that it is nigh impossible for them to get educations or find jobs or be integrated into society in any way. I don't know if the modern American mind can comprehend racism so strong that thousands of people live in the streets in houses made out of trash right now with little to no opportunity to improve life. And if it's that bad right now, I can't imagine how bad it was a couple hundred years ago, where these kinds of atrocities were less, I guess, frowned upon than they are right now. So, given that he's referred to by this term, Heathcliff is most likely ethnically Roma. He is, however, also referred to as a Little Lascar, with a Lascar being an Indian sailor in the UK, or a Spanish or American castaway, meaning he looks as if he could be Native American. Someone else once says to him, "Who knows but that your father was Emperor of China and your mother an Indian queen?" Heathcliff was taken from Liverpool, a vibrant port city, and most likely a place where people of all these ethnicities could realistically have ended up. So he could reasonably be any of these ethnicities, but I think the ambiguity is intentional. The people around him don't really know or care where he came from. They know all they need to know, which is that he isn't white enough to be considered or treated as an equal or person of worth. His race is a prominent factor in almost every facet of his life, from his first appearance with the Earnshaws. When he initially appears at 6 or 7 years old, he speaks a language none of them can understand, meaning someone has to have been taking care of him or else he wouldn't have learned that language. He's said to have physically fought off Mr. Earnshaw all the way back from Liverpool. By all accounts, this child was kidnapped and may very well have had people back home waiting for him, but since that child wasn't white, no one really cared. As Heathcliff grows older, his race is textually used as a reason to dismiss him from the household, and he's frequently referred to using racialized pejoratives. Mr. Earnshaw and the elder Cathy, the two people in his life who love him the most, refer to him respectively as dark as if he came from the devil himself, and black and cross. Heathcliff himself is very aware of his own race and the way that it intersects with his social status as an excuse to exclude him from society. As a child of 12 or 13, expressing his envy that the wealthy, blonde Edgar Linton has recently caught Cathy's attention, he says, quote, "I wish I had light hair and fair skin, and was dressed and behaved as well, and had a chance of being as rich as he will be." The adult Heathcliff, once he comes back with his own fortune, doesn't talk about his race, but he does continue to despise the Linton's blonde hair and blue eyes. Features that are the opposites of the one that he's been shunned for. Modern interpretations of the classics sometimes tease out now relevant social issues from subtext. Feminist interpretation of Beowulf. This is not that. Heathcliff's race and his mistreatment due to it aren't something that the text handles particularly coyly. He is being called on page slurs and saying he wishes he was white. You would have to be reading with one eye shut to miss it. Okay, sorry, I said I'd stop. While on the surface, having a villainous non white character isn't a great look and maybe hasn't aged well, a careful read reveals a very nuanced portrayal of a character who is lashing out due to mistreatment. Like, it's not racist to make him evil when he's evil because of racism. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. Another aspect of the novel less focused on, which is a shame because it's one of my personal favorites, is Hareton Earnshaw. This is but another symptom of the general overall neglect of the second generation. But Heathcliff and Hareton's relationship is just such a load bearing characterization for both of them. It's here that we see the worst and the best of what Heathcliff is capable of. Hareton is the son of Heathcliff's childhood tormentor. So not only has Heathcliff cheated him out of his inheritance and intentionally humiliated him, it's a very personal blow because Heathcliff himself went through all of that. And yet, at the same time, they have a relationship that's sometimes strangely affectionate. We see them joke and laugh together, and Heathcliff seems to genuinely like him. As a person, he doesn't like a lot of people. Because he is intentionally creating the very environment that traumatized him, he's accidentally catch 22'd himself into the mortifying chore of having empathy. Empathy that he uses on purpose to be crueler. I have a pleasure in Hareton. He has satisfied my expectations. If he were a born fool, I should not enjoy it half so much, but he is not a fool, and I can sympathize with all of his feelings, having felt them myself. I know what he suffers now, for instance, exactly. And the best of it is, Hareton is damnably fond of me. That is an insane way to think. It does so much to humanize Heathcliff while at the same time making him seem worse. It's a shame it's discussed as little as it is, and I'm very biased here because Hareton is my favorite character in the book, but he's my favorite character because this part of the book is interesting. So ultimately, this is a book about obsession and love and class. It's about all of the things that people claim it's about, and also about the things that people claim it's not about, because it's an incredibly complex work and it manages to do all of that. And that's the book and all the factors that I think are important. So now let's look at the movies. I watched 9 film adaptations of Wuthering Heights for this, which is not every film adaptation. I judge an adaptation as successful if it is both good at adapting the story and a good film in its own right. So it has to be a good movie and a good adaptation. It can't be just one. I'm primarily a reader who engages with very little visual media, so I'm maybe not the best judge of whether a movie is good, but I can make a judgment call. I can have opinions. Since my primary question is, has there been a good adaptation of Wuthering Heights? Films were selected based on chance of being any good, how well known they are, and my ability to actually access them. My apologies to like the 4 Bollywood versions that I couldn't find, but this article says you weren't very good anyway. So now this will be more a discussion than a ranking, but for convenience sake, I have created a totally objective and scientific airplane. For convenience sake, and because I used the word hypothesis earlier, which got me thinking about science, I did create a totally objective rubric or table by which to score each film. Each film will be awarded 1 point for being a good adaptation, 1 for being a good film, 1 for a sufficiently nasty Kathy, 1 for a sufficiently sympathetic Heathcliff, 1 for the presence of generally goth vibes, 1 for including the second generation, 1 for the presence of Hareton Earnshaw in any form because he is my son and I love him. The last point is a wild card, meaning I can give the film a boost for any facet I think like elevates the experience and isn't already on the rubric. I toyed with the idea of also adding a point for non-white Heathcliff, but this gets complicated in practice. Many of the adaptations use the racialized language from the book while casting an obviously white actor, and some of them are transformations, like translated into other cultures. So does the Filipino version get a point because he's Filipino, and does that count if they're all Filipino? I don't know. So we're just gonna no race point. This leaves us at a ranking out of 8. So each film at the end will get a numerical score, and then I can make a graph because I am a very serious scholar. For my discussions of the AUs, aka transformations into different settings, I will not be using the new names, because that would get really confusing. So if you're wondering why a Japanese noblewoman is named Catherine, this is why. I will be talking about them in order of release, which is not the order I watched them in, but hopefully that will give us an idea of how how they developed and how adaptations influenced each other. So let's watch some movies. 1939's Wuthering Heights is the closest thing we have to a definitive adaptation. Apart from one lost 1920 silent film, it is the first adaptation of the novel. This film was nominated for 8 Oscars and may well have won more of them if the competition hadn't been so stacked. Wuthering Heights was sharing the spotlight with Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. 1939 was a big year for Hollywood, but it did win for cinematography, and I can see why. The cinematography and moody atmosphere created by it are the strongest parts of the film. The first 10 minutes or so are perfect, no notes. The beginning with the eerie sound of wind and the slow camera pans. Mr. Lockwood first coming up to the inhabitants of the house and they all stare at him like they're wax figurines, not speaking. There's the famous "Let Me In" scene with Kathy's ghost banging on the window and begging to be let in. It's deliciously eerie and alarming. Just like in the novel, it casts this mood of anxious dread over the rest of the story. It is the only real supernatural element present, but since it comes right at the beginning, it makes you feel like anything can happen now. But the primary interest of this film is the romance, and not any of the things that flavor it. The racialized language from the book is used but not dwelt on, and so the ways that Heathcliff's racial identity affects him are pretty ignored. Class, similarly, is present due to its plot relevance, but not talked about. Heathcliff's revenge is all specifically to make Cathy jealous, not to get back at society. When he marries Isabella, it is only to make Cathy jealous, and her being her brother's heir is not mentioned. This focus on romance is effective for the movie they're trying to make, which is a broody, star-crossed love story. Hollywood of the area loved grandiose romances for some reason, but this focus flattens the characters significantly. Laurence Olivier, whichever. He gives a very good performance as Heathcliff. He combines ruthlessness with a certain wittiness and good humor that many later adaptations neglect in favor of portraying Heathcliff as grim and dangerous. The aging makeup is also insanely convincing in distinguishing the younger Heathcliff no last name from the older Mr. No first name Heathcliff. I think it's the hair also. They did a good job. But his place in society is pretty brushed off because while a racially ambiguous villain might have been tolerated, Hays Code America wouldn't have been able to handle a brown man as a leading love interest. Catherine, on the other hand, is declawed completely. She usually has a pleasant, ethereal expression on her face, even when she's dying. Once she grows into adulthood, she's never particularly cruel or capricious, wild, because of course a woman who is unpleasant cannot also be deserving of romantic interest. I can't help but link this de-racialized Heathcliff to the filmmaker's decision to flatten the story into a cut-and-paste romance. Since this was the first adaptation, it has flavored every adaptation since and made them all more likely to focus more on the romance than anything else. It's not worth going into the messy stuff, the domestic abuse and the class conflict, when you're adapting a famously classic romance. So even though this film is good at doing the thing it sets out to do, I can't help but resent both the adaptational choices and the later effect they had. Interestingly, the actress for Catherine, Merle Oberon, was of mixed British and Indian heritage, which she hid for most of her life in order to avoid discrimination. Combined with the fact that the set seems to have been a pretty miserable, stressful place to work, with a demanding director and leads who could not stand each other, it seems the themes of the book may have been more present in the production than in the film itself. When I started the 1953 Mexican adaptation Abismos de Pasión, I was immediately struck by the cinematography. The first 5 minutes were just music and visuals, and I couldn't tell what was happening, but I was transfixed. And then I noticed that the adaptation was very loose. I'd expected name changes, but I couldn't even tell which character corresponded to who, and there didn't seem to be enough characters anyway. This was a subtle hint to the fact that I was watching the wrong movie. I was not watching Abismos de Pasión. I was watching Elle by the same director. The word passion appears in the English title of both, hence the mix-up, and I didn't double-check until 20 minutes into the movie. Elle was pretty good. You guys should watch Elle. But back towards the point. I was eventually able to find Abismos de Pasión, but not with English subtitles, so I just watched it in Spanish, which I do not speak. I figured that between cognates and already knowing the plot I'd be alright, but given that, forgive me any details I might have missed. The place this film chooses to place the book's timeline is very unique and effective. It starts with Heathcliff, or Alejandro's, return, and covers the beginning of his revenge plans, his interference with Cathy or Catalina's marriage, and his wooing of Isabella, who remains Isabel. No name change necessary for her. It ends just after Cathy's death, with Heathcliff breaking into her coffin and being shot by an enraged Hindley to provide a clean ending. This corresponds to chapter 10 of volume 1 to chapter 3 of volume 2 of the original novel. The fact that the director was able to make an engaging feature film out of 6 chapters of a 34-chapter book tells you how rich the material being adapted is. This cross-section of the book is the ideal part to adapt if the focus is to be on Cathy and Heathcliff's relationship and not the larger family saga. The intensity of that relationship isn't going to be felt as strongly without witnessing their shared childhood history, but I assume some of that was given as expository dialogue in Spanish, which I do not speak. There was also a scene shortly after Heathcliff's return where he and Catherine go exploring the wildlife and dig out some toys out of an old tree, presumably somewhere they played together as children. This scene hints to their shared childhood without us having to witness it. I think watching in a language I don't speak actually elevated the experience because I couldn't think, he would not say that, if I couldn't tell what he was saying. Instead, I had to rely on the visuals and the performances and was thus able to fully take them in. Despite the second generation plot as a whole being cut, Hareton Earnshaw himself is here. He is a feral little boy who doesn't speak a single word of dialogue, trails after Joseph the manservant as he performs folk magic, and is visibly terrified of his father. The inclusion of Hareton as a neglected child shows that even as the plot was predisposed with Cathy and Heathcliff being natural disasters in real time, the generational cycles that put them on this path are quietly continuing in the background. The film contains plenty of gothic imagery, shadows and storms and sudden violence. It likes animal death to play as a mood enhancer in the background of scenes without being commented on, which is also something adapted from the novel. But even with all of that, the most gothic thing here is this understanding of how a family will haunt itself. Abysmas de Passion was easier both a better adaptation and a better film than the more famous 1939 version. I doubt English-speaking audiences at the time would have agreed because American films seem to like saccharine romances, but the moody, gothic atmosphere is much stronger here, and even though both make the story of romance, said gothic atmosphere makes the romance more interesting. Mexico, unsurprisingly, understands cycles of culturally sanctioned generational rot better than MGM does. Go figure. This 1964 made-for-TV adaptation is not particularly well known, but it was very necessary for me to watch because it is the adaptation that inspired Kate Bush's song, and is thus more culturally relevant than, like, Shakespeare. It is 3 hours long, so it covers the full events of the novel and is by far the most beat-by-beat accurate. It included exact lines of dialogue from the book and was one of the only ones to include an age-accurate Nellie Dean. She's usually portrayed as an old woman, but she's meant to be the same age as Hindley, so she should be a teenager in the beginning and only a few years older than Cathy and Heathcliff. The book-accurate scene that delighted me the most is when Edgar Linton confronts Heathcliff for being too close to his wife and tries to kick him out of his house, and Catherine and Heathcliff team up to call him a pathetic coward.
This lamb of yours threatens like a bull, Cathy. It is in danger of splitting its skull against my knuckles.
If you are too cowardly to attack him without help from the servants, then I hope he may flog you sick. He might correct your feigning more valor than you possess.
Absolute cinema. The only thing I noticed omitted was the frame story, although Cathy's ghost banging on the window is still there, and the scene where drunk Hindley drops his toddler off the top of his staircase and Heathcliff catches him. Not one adaptation includes that scene. Not one of them will see heaven. Maybe they think it would read a little cartoonish visually. I don't know. They don't get it. The limited budget created an atmosphere that reminded me of a stage play. There was very little music, and most of the shots were further and ran longer, with many characters and set pieces crammed into the frame and interacting with each other. It felt simple and intimate, like we were actually looking into someone's living room. Instead of music, there were a lot of ambient wind noises, and people talking over one another to create a layered soundscape, which added up to a surprisingly effective atmosphere that didn't feel overdone. But even though I don't have any real complaints, I'm not sure how someone who isn't a pre-existing fan of the book would appreciate the style created by the production value here, especially since by now it's pretty dated. I'm glad Kate Bush at least appreciated it. This 1988 film transports the setting to feudal Japan, and out of all the transformations, it takes the most advantage of its new setting. Very dark and atmospheric, relishing in death and the grotesque, it leans heavily into the supernatural aspect. partially in the spooky ambiance, but most obviously with the nature and name of the Heathcliff character, who here is called Onimaru. An Oni is a creature from Japanese mythology that I usually see translated as demon or ogre, and Maru is, as far as I could tell, a historical suffix for male names. I love to name my adopted child Devilbert and rest easily in the knowledge that this probably isn't an omen of any kind. This Heathcliff seemed more like a representation of a wild, dark nature. He was thwarted desire embodied in a person, not necessarily a victim of society. In any other setting, I would not have liked this approach, but it worked here, partially because I'm not sure how well the racial subtext would have adapted into the setting, and more so because this was still a very socially aware story in how deftly it handled family and gender, especially gender. This film portrays a Catherine who's constantly chafing at the way womanhood is imposed on her. She's more of a main character than past Catherines have been, and she's far more active, using manipulation to further her own goals. The women here in general, actually, are more active players than their counterparts from the original. We see Catherine secluded in the ritualistic woman's hut after her first period, and confronted with what being a woman means in this context. Later, when family tradition demand that she, as a woman, be sent away to serve as a priestess, she manipulates the Edgar Linton character into asking to marry her so that she doesn't have to leave her home. This tradition of priesthood was where I realized how creative the adaptation was being. It wasn't just taking the events of the novel and portraying them in a new setting, it was taking ideas from the novel and using the setting to find new ways to express these ideas. Not all the events were the same, but the themes and motifs all were, so it felt like it understood the spirit of the book more than adaptations that were more faithful. It was both more erotic and more sexually violent than the source material, but in the context of how aware of gender the film is, the sexual content did not feel gratuitous. It was another way of continuing that awareness. Anyway, it was good. The atmosphere was completely mesmerizing to the point I forgot I was watching with a critical eye and started just watching a movie I was enjoying. Better yet, everyone was appropriately a freak. I really liked this one. Initially, the atmosphere of this 1991 adaptation from the Philippines was very good. It opens with a funeral, whose funeral I could not figure out, but it's a good tone setter. The final shot is of the ghosts of now dead Kathy and Heathcliff running through the trees and laughing, with Nellie watching and reflecting on how good it once was and how badly it ended. That was nice. The Heathcliff here is very, very good. The actor always seemed hungry, like there was a deep, ravenous desire in him he was just barely suppressing. The Kathy was fine. As this adaptation continued, I began to realize it was more an adaptation of the 1939 film than of the book. Heathcliff and Kathy as children romp around the hills and talk about her being a princess of the castle, like how in the 1939 film they talk about their spot on the rocks being their fairy tale castle. There's also a scene where a pining Isabella Linton stops by the house and pretends her car is broken down as an excuse to see Heathcliff. There's no equivalent scene in the book, but there is a scene in the 1939 film where Isabella stops by and pretends her horse is lame. The one thing that this film does that is unique to it is the possessive, jealous violence of this Edgar. When Kathy decides she's going to run away with Heathcliff and tells her husband, he reacts with physical violence that drives her to suicide. Presumably this change was made to heighten the drama and make Heathcliff looks better by contrast. I grant that there are likely influences from culture and genre here that I'm not equipped to appreciate. It felt very telenovela, but independently of whether or not this was a good storytelling choice or not, it was needlessly graphic, and I did not like seeing Edgar get explosive and beat his wife into a miscarriage. It felt like I was watching actual domestic violence, and it made me more uncomfortable than anything from the book did. Even though it wasn't very bad in the technical sense, I could not wait for this movie to be over so that I did not have to watch it anymore. This version cuts the frame story that was already there and replaces it with opening and closing scenes of the author, Emily Bronte herself, for some reason, informing us that as we hear the story, we are not to laugh, or even to smile. This movie knows that it is a grim, godless tale, and by God did Heathcliff's actor get the memo. This man looks like he doesn't possess the facial muscles required to smile, but he is a very effective brooder. In service to this dark tone, his dynamic with Kathy is very sexually charged from the first, especially because events that transpired with pre-adolescent actors in the novel, like sleeping in the same bed and playing around on the moors, physically wrestling, happen with adult characters here. This was the only version I found to include the delicious detail of Heathcliff going to Kathy's wake and replacing Edgar's hair in her locket with his own hair, which isn't sensual, but it feels intimate. All of that said, even though this film was trying hard to be dark and moody, most of it felt tame to the point of being dull, and it lacked a certain bite. For example, when Heathcliff describing the Lintons in the book, overlaid with the same scene in the film. And now guess what your good children were doing. Isabella, I believe she is 11, a year younger than Kathy, lay screaming. Edgar stood weeping silently, and in the middle of the table sat a little dog, shaking his paw and yelping, which, from their mutual accusations, we understood they had nearly pulled in two between them. The idiots! That was their pleasure, to quarrel who should hold a heap of warm hair, and then each begin to cry because both, after struggling to get it, refused to take it. We laughed outright at the petted things. We did despise them. Do we see the contrast? This film did contain the best Hareton and Kathy, though the second generation was rushed through and not really as effective without the proper setup. The actors here did a good job portraying the more playful, gentle nature of their courtship. Catherine II was in fact played by the same actress as her mother, Juliette Binoche, who is not Julia Roberts, a fact I had to keep reminding myself of as I watched. The Kathy in the 1968 version, or was it 1967? I don't remember. The black and white 60 version. That Kathy played double duty as well, but I noticed it more here. It was a fun way to drive home the parallels between the characters, in case you guys didn't already get it by them having the same names and initials. Whatever other qualms I may have had, this film gave me Hareton gently feeding a newborn lamb, and there's a lot I would forgive for that. The voice that Tom Hardy uses as Heathcliff is a prototypical version of the voice he uses as Bane in The Dark Knight Rises 2 years later, which tells you something about how villainous a character Heathcliff can be, and also told me specifically what Tom Hardy looked like because I had not connected his face with his voice.
You brought it, have you? I feared I'd have to come down and fetch my property myself.
No one cared who I was till I put on the mask.
The villainous voice is ironic, however, because this version seems afraid to let Heathcliff, or Catherine for that matter, do anything wrong. I don't doubt that the director was fond of the source material, but he seemed to have let that fondness cripple him. Heathcliff's mistreatment at the hands of Hindley is emphasized more than in other versions, though the greater structural issues of class and race less so. And I expected this to be set up for him to eventually bite back like a beaten dog, but no, he remains very mild. The brooding is superficial and not reflected in his actions. He even tries sincerely to be good to Isabella Linton when he marries her, and seems regretful that he can't make himself love her like he loves Kathy. Compare this to the Heathcliff of the novel. I like Isabella too well, my dear Heathcliff, to let you absolutely seize and devour her up, and I like her too ill to attempt it, said he, except in a very ghoulish fashion. You'd hear of odd things if I lived alone with that mawkish, waxen face. Most ordinary would be painting on its white the colors of the rainbow, and turning the blue eyes black every day or two. They detestably resemble Linton's. It's just not the same character. Catherine has similarly lost all of her bite and doesn't seem to have a spiteful bone in her body. Catherine who shook a toddler and then hit her fiancé for stopping her. Which is a shame because Charlotte Riley very much looks the part, mildly anachronistic costuming aside. Victorian literature is full of more straightforward love stories, so it seems like a waste to repeatedly make adaptations that otherwise take care to be accurate except in horribly mischaracterizing the main characters. This version does adapt the second generation plot, albeit with less time and attention than it gives the first generation. There's an air of going through the motions for the sake of finishing it, but by that point the heart has gone out of the story and everything is rushed. Heathcliff is satisfyingly villainous to Hareton and Kathy II in this part, to give him his due, but it came too late to win me over and did not redeem the way he and Kathy's characterization was butchered. Ladies and gentlemen, 160 years, and at last we have a non-white Heathcliff, a milestone for film. This version focuses the most on Heathcliff and Kathy's shared childhood, and seems the most interested in exploring the events of the first half of the novel as the person-forming foundational experiences when they are, hence the racial element. The adolescent actors get more screen time than the adult actors. In fact, this is the only adaptation to correctly portray the characters as children during certain pivotal scenes, such as the part where they first encounter the Lintons and are attacked by the dog. This film seems to understand better than others that it's childhood experiences, not just experiences in general, that shape these characters into who they are. The child actors performed wonderfully, especially young Kathy, who was so wild and magnetic that it made me understand why Heathcliff was so drawn to her. Director Andrea Arnold intentionally cast school children without acting experience, and this choice was very effective in creating atmosphere. Atmosphere is something this film cared about deeply. Atmosphere is something this film maybe cared a little too much about. This is unfortunately the kind of movie people are talking about when they say art film and mean it as an insult. It was very moody and artsy and takes a lot of stylistic care. The transitions between scenes are marked by tone-setting close-ups of animals or scenery, and most of the footage was filmed with a nauseatingly shaky handheld camera. There was very little dialogue. The passionate speeches of the book are largely condensed into one or two line exchanges, which forces you to engage with the visuals instead. But the pacing is so slow that the 2-hour film felt 4 hours long. There is also very little music, with a notable exception of a Mumford & Sons song that begins playing during the last scene and runs into the credits and is so jarring that I genuinely started laughing out loud. I love Mumford & Sons. I check the thrift for their CDs every time I'm there, but it did not fit into this film in particular, especially as like the only piece of music we had. I'm disappointed with how little I liked this film because I usually enjoy slow pretension. I saved this film for last because I was looking forward to it, but this movie is joyless. Even when Heathcliff and Cathy are playing and laughing as children, you're witnessing their joy, not partaking in it. Ultimately, it was trying so hard to be serious that it became dreary, and Wuthering Heights is many things, but boring should not be one of them. This tone most hurts the characterization of Heathcliff, with whom we're voyeuristically close to and yet emotionally distant from. Heathcliff is our point of view character. Any scenes he couldn't have witnessed are omitted even if they're plot significant. Many of the shots are of the back of his head, so we see what he's looking at and thinking about. When he returns to the Heights having made his fortune, there's a long shot that rests entirely on Cathy, even though Linton is speaking to them from out of frame. But Heathcliff speaks and emotes so little that it's hard to tell what he thinks and feels about anything, even if we know what he's looking at. I cannot imagine this version of the character saying any of the bitingly sarcastic things that Heathcliff says in the book. Frankly, I can't imagine this version of Heathcliff saying much of anything, and I should know things about the character whose perspective I'm watching from. Despite good intentions, this film prioritized style over substance. It paradoxically holds you at arm's length while also breathing down your neck. And also you are asleep, because it is boring, only to be violently awoken by Mumford & Sons during the credits. And to end this all on a high note, we have Wuthering High, sometimes under the name The Wrong Boyfriend, which was released in 2015 on the Lifetime channel. I do not know why Lifetime felt they had any business adapting Wuthering Heights as a contemporary teen drama. I don't think Wuthering Heights makes for a good high school AU, but by God did Lifetime try. If you are unaware, Lifetime has a reputation for what I will affectionately call mom movies, dramas or thrillers about women, or worse yet, teenagers being endangered and preyed upon. Their ripped from the headline series often takes inspiration from real-life crime so that the moms watching can be frightened by the idea that the plot elements are threatening to their real-life teenage children. The artistic choices made for Wuthering High are very interesting. A Heathcliff whose mother has just been deported to Mexico is a very different character than a foundling or kidnapped child who has grown up with no one else. A Catherine who recently witnessed the suicide of her mother and has since changed is a deeply unnecessary but deeply Lifetime touch. Joseph the religious zealot as an enthusiastically abstinence-only health class teacher is actually pretty funny. I did like that one. This movie is not very good. The actress playing Cathy makes one face the entire movie, and the Malibu setting did not fit the story. This was until the last 5-ish minutes, when it got so ridiculous that it entirely redeemed itself and was revealed to be a subversive comedy. Cathy decides she cannot live now that she's been iced out by Heath, who is ignoring her and is taken up with Bella Linton, which he has no reason to do in a universe where there's no fortune to steal and he's been ignoring Cathy, so it can't be to make her jealous because he's ignoring her attentions anyway. Also, I'm not sure why her name is Bella now. Isabella is already a modern name. There's 2 Isabellas in my sister's middle school. Anyway, distraught, the rejected Cathy walks backwards into the CGI ocean and lets the CGI waves take her. After the funeral, Heath breaks into the graveyard to die at her grave. Good riddance to you both. The best thing about this book is its embrace of the unnatural, the grotesque, the strange. The most common recurring word in its earliest reviews was strange. It's a weird book and it knows it. The film adaptations, by contrast, largely did not know it. They did not throw that baby off a staircase, they did not call Heathcliff any slurs, and they were not obsessed with death and decay and rotting. They shied away from the very things that give the story their edge because these things were not conductive to making a bodice ripper. Every pattern of adaptational failure here goes back to the decision to transform a story about how abuse twists passion into something dangerous, into A bodice ripper. I wanted to rank these movies, but I cannot think of a metric by which to judge them. The most accurate, the 1968 and the 1992, are too bland to really be worth evaluating. The best films by far are the Mexican Abismos de Pasión and the Japanese one that is usually localized as Wuthering Heights, so I'm not going to try to say it in Japanese. These are worth watching and each capture the spirit of the book, so like as I complain, these don't count. These are the exception. But because they're so transformed, they don't satiate my desire for a faithful adaptation. As I have mentioned enough times that you could probably make a drinking game out of it by now, the primary lens through which I read this novel is one of generational cycles and the factors that create them. So the way I've judged these adaptations is through that lens. But this is a famously dense book that people famously argue about the quote unquote true meaning of. So maybe these adaptations would be judged differently by someone more interested in class or race or gender or destructive obsession or metaphysical romance or ghosts as a metaphor for whatever you want ghosts to represent. But this is also kind of to my point because, bar the two adaptations mentioned above, for the most part, the films were not able to capture the complexities that led to this being a work that is so widely interpreted. The adaptations were all more flat and simplistic. Once the 1939 version followed the trends of its time and flattened the story into a romance, every version thereafter was haunted by this choice. Most seem to see the childhood section as a chore you need to get through before you get to do the juicy stuff with the adult actors. As a result, many adaptations take some pivotal scenes that happen during childhood and have them play out with adult actors. Kathy being bitten by a dog and entering the Linton Society, which happens to her at age 12 and is read by some scholars as a symbolic menarche, is happening to a full-grown, not Julia Roberts. Heathcliff lashing out at Edgar during Christmas dinner and being beaten by Hindley, a humiliation and rejection that happened to a 13-year-old boy after one of his first attempts to please society and, quote, be good, is happening to a full-grown Tom Hardy. These kinds of things are character defining when they happen to a child, but only one adaptation showed them as children during these scenes, because examining how a hostile world shapes a child is irrelevant to making a romance novel. The 2011 was the one that used child actors, but it immediately squandered what goodwill it had earned with me by being a first half only adaptation, so picking at the ages of characters is perhaps a bit silly, but it's indicative of a larger problem of not knowing or caring what nuance is. In another example of this, not one of the adaptations, even the transformed ones that I like, took advantage of the book's nested narrators, the way that the main narrator is Linton and he's then being told the story by Nellie, who's sometimes repeating things recounted to her. None of the adaptations consider how its different narratives could be biased and how they could be coloring or shaping the story. None of them seem to know what to do with Nellie at all. Nellie in the book is a very shrewd and intelligent woman who has unique and complex relationships with all of the main characters. She's sometimes cut altogether, and if she is there, it's usually aged up to an old woman. Just a quiet, elderly servant with no opinions, a narrative tool and not a character. Nellie, who is the same age as Hindley and once nonchalantly sassed her drunken, angry boss as he tried to stick a knife in her mouth, which is another insane scene that not one adaptation touched. I know that someone is going to try to tell me that Nellie was prominent in the Fennel adaptation, but I didn't like what the Fennel adaptation did with her. I don't think I like the idea that servants are morally responsible for the bad decisions of their employers, even though it is an alarmingly common takeaway. Less than half of the adaptations, 4 out of the 9, included the second generation and Heathcliff's Full Revenge. This number would have been even lower if there weren't at least 2 adaptations that I neglected because I knew they wouldn't adapt the full half. Notably, I'm thinking of the 1970 Timothy Dalton version. I don't know why Timothy Dalton has played every Bronte male. But without the second half, this is a different story with a different ending. The full story invites us to see how suffering breeds more suffering, and yet how you can stop it. Adapting just the first half has us ogling at this destructive obsession and passion, like we're looking at zoo animals. Now, if we look to my very serious and scientific graph made with data gathered through my very serious and scientific rubric, we see that the highest scoring are, unsurprisingly, the Japanese and Mexican, respectively. Because these are transformations, I think they actually had the advantage because they weren't inhibited by the technical difficulties. Like, time frame and too many characters, and were able to just be very creative and unhindered and play with vibes. You see these technical difficulties, among other difficulties, here in the cluster of adaptations that attempted to be scene accurate. So the 68, the 92, the 2011, and the 2011. None of them had any particular oomph factor, and they all scored very similarly, bar the 68, which got an extra point because it is by far the most accurate. Wuthering High obviously scored but a single point due to being a gag watch, and the Filipino one scored very low due to being both mid and distasteful to me personally. The 1937 scored lower than the more accurate ones, despite being more technically cinematographically, not a word, cinematographically impressive. We're just gonna pretend it's a word. You know what I'm saying? And being, more famous. These have been my overall findings. I will put my spreadsheet of data up for anyone so inclined to pause and read. This is the extent of my scientific prowess. Ultimately, jokes aside, I don't think the story is ever going to work in 2 hours. It really needs a miniseries to have room to breathe, but also I don't trust anyone to touch it for another few years due to current events. Many people have been dissecting the story of late. There has been a lot of interesting input given by many people, so I doubt that I've tread any particularly new ground. If you can believe it, this project was in the works before current events were even announced, and the only proof I can give is that I have B-roll footage that I'm not sure I'm using of me reading the book that's like from 2 haircuts and 2 jobs ago. I just work abysmally slowly. But unique or not, my hypothesis was correct. Every failed adaptation failed for lack of understanding of the richness of the story. I wish I had more to say here that I didn't already say in my introduction. I wish I'd been wrong, that the films were good and that I'd enjoyed them. So what is the verdict? Has there been a good adaptation of Wuthering Heights? Yes. Everyone thank 18-year-old Kate Bush and her synth.